David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Let's talk today for a while about how governments can and should deal with recessions. This is an important question right now. The unemployment rate is skyrocketing. More than 20 million people, 23 million people have lost their jobs in the last 5 weeks. We learned today that GDP was down almost 5% in the first quarter of the year. We are seeing some ideas that second quarter GDP could be down as much as 20% or even more. So we have a serious situation here, recession, depression, and we need to think about what are the options for what governments can do? What has Trump done? And is he doing a good job or isn't he doing a good job? And what I want to suggest to you today is that given the circumstances, Donald Trump has actually used most of the correct measures that are available under the paradigm of Keynesian economics to deal with a recession, but he's done it in a completely incompetent, crony, and slow way. And these are policies that are direct contradictions to what Republicans claim are the policies that a government should institute. So there's also an element of hypocrisy, but we'll get to that. So to start with, governments have two major sets of sort of tools at their disposal: monetary policy and fiscal policy. And very simply, when we say fiscal policy, we mean government spending to influence the economy. And when we say monetary policy, we're talking about treasury management. In our case, it's whoever manages the currency, treasury management of the money supply and of interest rates. So fiscal policy would include things like spending on infrastructure during a recession to create jobs, hire businesses to fix bridges. The businesses pay those employees that are doing the work. Those employees then go and spend that money in the economy, helping the grocery store and the landscaping company then hire, and so on and so forth. So that's fiscal policy. Then you've got monetary policy. Monetary policy would be, for example, cutting interest rates to encourage loans, making loans cheaper so that people will go and borrow money with which they can pay for expenses, buy things, maybe pay employees, etc. When coronavirus hits, businesses start to close, people stop traveling, a bunch of things happen without government intervention that aren't good. This increases unemployment naturally. There's a demand collapse. People stop going to restaurants, so the restaurant no longer needs their workers, so they lay them off, which means the restaurant owner isn't making any money. They can't pay their rent, or maybe they can't pay their utilities, so that affects their landlord. The restaurant doesn't have customers, so it doesn't need to buy food. So they stop spending with the food supplier. The food supplier doesn't need to buy as much stuff from farmers. The farmers no longer need as many employees. I think you can sort of understand that. Now, the food example is a more interesting one because you see a demand reduction at restaurants, but an increase at grocery stores. But as we've learned with toilet paper, oftentimes the personal and commercial supply chains for some of these goods are separate. So that's sort of a detail, but I think you generally understand the idea here. The other thing that can happen in a recession is that you get a deflationary spiral. So in the same way that if everybody wants hand sanitizer, the price of sanitizer gets driven up, which we saw about 7-8 weeks ago. If, for example, nobody's driving around, this leads to a drop in oil and gasoline prices, which we've seen. Now, we may not care that much about oil prices being low. It sounds intuitive that lower prices are just good, right? I mean, if we're in a recession and stuff costs less, that's good. It means people can afford more of it. The problem is that it can cause more unemployment. If you run a business and suddenly not only do people want less of your stuff, but you have to lower the price because people aren't willing to pay as much for it, that furthers not being able to keep employees on. So you lay people off, which means they don't have money to buy stuff, which means the deflation continues. That's why it's called a spiral. In a healthy economy, you might see some deflation because we get better at making something. So if we become much more efficient at making a particular product, we lower our cost to make each one of those items. And as companies compete with each other, whoever can increase productivity and lower costs can maybe gain more market share. So that's okay. That's a good example of prices coming down, deflation. Deflationary spirals in a recession aren't good. So let's now look at the things Donald Trump has done, or things that have been done, if not by Donald Trump personally. So the Fed cut interest rates. Great. That's monetary policy. That's the right thing to do. The Treasury has created these PPP programs, Paycheck Protection Plan programs, where the interest rate is effectively negative. You get money, and as long as you use it for the right things, the loan doesn't have to be paid back in full. That's the correct thing to do. Now, the problem is they did it in the crony capitalist way that Trump always seems to do. It took too long. There were all sorts of logistical failures. The system didn't actually start distributing money for a month or longer. Money ran out too quickly. A lot of the money went to really large corporations and other institutions instead of small businesses. Small businesses ended up not being able to get money. Trump has to scramble, ask for more money, and ask for money back. Total disaster in its implementation. But it is policy that makes sense. Now, there's a practical way in which PPP is kind of a blend of monetary and fiscal policy. It's sort of like low interest loans, which is monetary, but forgivable loans to business are sort of like government spending, which is fiscal policy. But that's kind of a detail in terminology. Another important monetary policy component is expectations management. This is part of why, remember we talked last week or the week before, we get bad unemployment news, and yet the stock market sometimes goes up. What's going on? Managing expectations is part of monetary policy. You tell the public in advance what you expect to see happen so that it more this is the goal, right? It more smoothly gets priced into the markets. And then when the news hits, it's not a shock to the system because the markets were expecting it anyway. That is a form of monetary policy, expectations management. So let's now talk about fiscal stimulus. You can do fiscal stimulus by cutting taxes. So when Trump proposed, it didn't happen, but Trump proposed, what if we do a waiver or a moratorium on the payroll tax until the end of the year? That would be a form of fiscal stimulus through a tax cut. You can also do fiscal stimulus by the government spending money. This can be buying things. This can be hiring companies to do stuff. It can also be just the government sending people checks. Could be a one-time payment, which we've seen could be by increasing unemployment benefits. What we're talking about is deficit spending. There are sort of people on the right who like to cartoonify this as printing money. We talked last week with Stephanie Kelton about that. Calling it printing money is not really an accurate term. What we're talking about is deficit spending. We're talking about digitally adding money to people's accounts. Now, again, Trump is doing this. He's boosting unemployment benefits. That's fiscal policy. It's getting money to people, which people can then spend, increasing aggregate demand, maintain prices relatively level, more level than they otherwise would be. When Trump cuts $1,200 checks, or really the Treasury does, that's fiscal policy. It's government spending. Now, they also sent billions to some industries, airlines, cruise companies. That's also fiscal stimulus. And it is the right tool, but the problem has been, again, implementation. Took way too long. Not nearly enough money for the average individual. A ton of the spending was done with companies that really shouldn't be the priority, should have been more money for individuals. We heard last week from billionaire investor Chamath Palihapitiya, who said that some of the companies being bailed out, these are really bailing out. These are bailouts of the billionaires who are speculating, not the employees. If you really want to bail out employees, you can do it in a much more direct way. In addition, Trump has done it in a completely crony capitalist way. He's reduced oversight, which has turned some of these bailout funds into essentially slush funds. He's used government money to buy things like ventilators and PPE. That's stimulus, except there's always something weird when Trump does it, like the company that is bankrupt with no employees, which has gotten a big contract to essentially just middleman the purchase of a bunch of masks way above market value. So it's the right tool. It's being done in a crony capitalist way. The focus is often wrong. It took forever. Millions have still gotten nothing. The unemployment insurance supplements have still not been received by a lot of people. So in short, Donald Trump has used the right tools under the Keynesian paradigm, and I'll talk more about that in a second, fiscal policy, monetary policy, but he's done it in an incompetent way. And it is, of course, massive hypocrisy, because what we hear from the right year in and year out is, one, we don't have the money for this. That's clearly untrue. We found it, right? And it's not really finding it. That's a misnomer, but we were able to do it despite Republicans saying it's not possible. So there's the hypocrisy element. And number two, you often hear Republicans saying that these types of techniques don't actually work, and yet here they are saying, hey, we've actually got to do it. So incompetence and hypocrisy, but the right tools have been used. Now, what hasn't Trump done that he could have done? Infrastructure spending. Trump has talked about doing infrastructure spending. It would be important to do 6 solid months of infrastructure spending. So have the government spend on fixing roads, bridges, tunnels. The electric grid could be bolstered. Water supply could be better protected. There's tons of things that could be done. They would boost employment. They would inject money. And when we come out of this, whenever it is, we would be better prepared. We would have better infrastructure to resume all of that economic activity. It's not been done. It's time to do it. Trump should have already gotten this going. He talks maybe it'll happen in the next phase. We don't know. That certainly has been a mistake. Now let's zoom out from all of this. Why? Everything I've been talking about, these fiscal policy tools, these are what we call Keynesian tools. They're from the School of Fiscal Policy founder, John Maynard Keynes. Our government has these tools available instead of other tools because Keynesian economics are sort of the orthodoxy. And this is based on, you see a recession fundamentally as a demand shortage, and you then take these reactions of fiscal policy that we've described. That is not the only way to see the role of government before and during a recession or a depression. A more progressive economic worldview would say, all right, David, you've accurately described the Keynesian tools, but those tools are not proactive. They are reactive. So I'll give you some examples of what a more progressive, proactive perspective would be. A more progressive economic perspective would say the federal government should always be bolstering state unemployment insurance. So if they did that all along and people got more money from unemployment insurance, if more money was available at the state level, then you wouldn't see this panicked scramble to do it now. But you wouldn't see the decrease in demand that you are seeing now because people don't have money. Another perspective, the federal government should always be funding more education and other government jobs so that when you have a recession, a lot of those jobs just continue and you avoid having to bail out as many companies with loans. You avoid having to send as many people $1,200 checks because a lot of these government jobs, including in education, can simply continue. Now, that's a political perspective that right-wingers often disagree with. Others would say if we had permanent universal basic income, we would obviate the need for as much of this desperate spending because people would already be getting that baseline income from the government, and thus this pandemic recession would be less of an emergency. It would still be one, but it would be less of an emergency. If we had, here we go now, government-run healthcare, you wouldn't need Trump negotiating with insurance companies to waive copays on coronavirus testing or treatment. It would simply be done because the government is more involved in healthcare. So that exceeds our time today. But the seed I'm planting is Trump has used the right tools given the system we have. He's used them incompetently, but there are more progressive economic perspectives which would say if we had much more government involvement all along in employment, in fiscal policy, all the time, it would prevent as much of an emergency need for that to be done right now. Many people don't want more government involvement, and that's a political debate. So I hope that this is useful to people. There's been a clamoring for more policy stuff like this. I'll produce what the people want. Let me know. Let me know your thoughts on this particular segment on Twitter @DPAC.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new members of the day are Joe Craig and Mark LaPrade. Joe and Mark, thank you for your support. Very much appreciated. Also want to say thanks to today's longtime sustainer of the day. That's Michael Cerciaro, who has been a member for almost 5 years. Grab a membership, don't be shy, at joinpakman.com. All right, it is the time of the week where we get to Hatriot Mail, a professional interpretive reading of the Hatriot Mail that I receive. Quick reminder about Hatriot Mail.
Because if you aren't pro-life, you deserve the death penalty. Hatriot Mail. Written by patriots who hate David Pakman. Because America. And because freedom.
All right, a lot in this one, many allegations. Let's take a listen to it together.
Neoliberal shill David Pakman admits he's an accomplice of Donald J. Trump. David Pakman is a shill for the New World Order Illuminati Luciferian cabal that is doing everything in its power to destroy the United States. Amy Robach knows that Epstein was murdered. David Pakman lies about Pizzagate as he knows it's real. David Pakman, you corporate shill, can't wait until you go through with quitting YouTube.
Yeah, you know, this neoliberal thing, let's assume it's not a troll and you really think that I've become some kind of right-winger. Check out over the last 10 years on the show, every few years, I will do a bunch of different political compass type tests. And every time I do it, I have actually moved to the left. I am more left today than I have ever been before in my life. Now, as far as, lied about Pizzagate, quitting YouTube, stuff like that, I don't know what you're talking about. But if you really want to do the homework and see, have I become more conservative or more left over the years? The data is out there, my friend. Check it out. Remember that you can use the coupon code HATRIOT40 to save 40% off of any membership at joinpakman.com. The coupon code is HATRIOT40. You save 40%. The Hatriots cry. I've seen them do it every time that coupon code is used on my website. The current administration is going to go down not just as one of the most incompetent, but as one of the most uncaring and immoral administrations in modern American political history. And why am I saying this today? I mean, I could really say it on any day, but yesterday, Vice President Mike Pence went to the Mayo Clinic for a staged photo op, and he refused to wear a mask. Now, a mask aside, you could make the argument he really shouldn't be going at all. Traveling from Washington, D.C. to Minnesota at all, especially for someone like Pence, who's around a whole bunch of people all the time, going to a place where people are being treated for coronavirus and other serious conditions, introducing germs. Why even do it? It's a bad idea. He shouldn't do it at all. But he went for the photo op, and he was told to wear a mask, and he did not. As you can see if you're watching today, everybody wearing a mask, Secret Service, the patient, nurses, people in the back room, but Mike Pence not wearing a mask. The Mayo Clinic tweeted, quote, Mayo Clinic had informed Vice President of the masking policy prior to his arrival today. They told him, but Pence refused to wear a mask. The Mayo Clinic ended up deleting their tweet about having told Pence about the mask policy about 3 hours after they posted it. Were they pressured by the administration? We don't know, but that tweet was since deleted by the Mayo Clinic. Here is Mike Pence surrounded by people with masks. He's the one guy in the room without one. Take a look, take a listen.
Pretty impressive. Right. And this started and got approved with the FDA, with Mayo, in 2 weeks instead of the usual 8, many months.
Even faster than that, Dr. March from FDA sent us a protocol on March 30th. I worked closely with Dr.
So why didn't Mike Pence wear a mask? He was asked, and he says, because he is regularly tested for the virus and he wants to look people in the eye. Take a look.
Mr. Vice President, there's obviously been some controversy since you got here about the decision not to wear a mask around the Mayo Clinic, as the governor and other officials here did. Could you just walk us through why you made the decision not to wear the mask, even though the clinic said that they tweeted that they had asked you to do so?
Well, let me say, as Vice President of the United States, I'm tested for the coronavirus on a regular basis, and everyone who is around me is tested for the coronavirus. And when the CDC issued guidelines about wearing a mask, it was their recognition that people that may have the coronavirus could prevent the possibility of conveying the virus to someone else by wearing a mask. And since I don't have the coronavirus, I thought it'd be a good opportunity for me to be here, to be able to speak to these researchers, these incredible healthcare personnel, and look them in the eye and say thank you.
He wanted to look people in the eye to say thank you. Does Mike Pence know that you don't cover your face? I'm sorry, that you don't cover your eyes with the mask. You're only covering your nose and mouth. Someone tweeted me about this. He said, David, maybe Mike Pence is used to a type of white face mask that does cover your entire face, if you guys know what I mean. That's a joke, by the way, I think, as far as I know anyway. So this is one of the dumbest explanations, and this includes the testing thing. Now, Mike Pence says he's tested regularly and people around him are tested regularly. You could be incubating the disease. It's possible you could be contagious before a test result would come back positive. We just don't know. And of course, Pence is flying around. He's the last person who should be going to a hospital without wearing a mask. If Mike Pence brought an asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic early case of coronavirus to the Mayo Clinic, do you realize the amount of havoc that he could personally wreak? It is infuriating and it is toxically irresponsible, but they don't care. Now, what do I think the real reason is why Mike Pence didn't wear a mask? They manage by optics, okay? They want to pretend that we're on the other side of this pandemic. They want to pretend like, hey, listen, states are opening, everything's good, we're about to win. If a vice president who has not been seen wearing a mask for months during the pandemic, all of a sudden on April 28th, for the first time wears a mask in public, the optics are not that we've almost won. Now, of course, we've not almost won. It would be accurate to realize that we've not almost won, but it's management by optics, and Pence doesn't want to be seen wearing a mask. What I would like to have seen is the Mayo Clinic simply deny Mike Pence entry. Now, I know it's the vice president. I know he flew there from Washington, D.C. These things are carefully choreographed like a dance. It would have been a very bold move for the Mayo Clinic to do that. But I find it more bold and certainly more disrespectful and disgusting for Pence to go in there without a mask. You have people who have family members at the Mayo Clinic with coronavirus, family members, and they're not allowed to go visit at all, never mind with a mask, because the risk is too great. And Mike Pence flies in from D.C. and is walking around with no mask. I hope that when this is all over, and by that I mean the virus and this administration, and hopefully that's sooner than later on both counts, I hope we don't forget how incompetent this administration is, but I also hope we don't forget how disrespectful and flat out terrible people this administration has been made up of, because it is absolutely and completely disgusting. We'll have more coverage of this on our Instagram page, at David Pakman Show. Also follow me on Instagram at david.pakman. If you're looking for a break from bad news every day, follow my urban gardening experience, which I am reporting on consistently on my Instagram page at david.pakman. We'll take a quick break and be back right after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to welcome to the program today Rutger Bregman, who is a historian and also author of Humankind, A Hopeful History, and the best-selling Utopia for Realists. You may also recognize him from such viral moments as that time he said the thing about taxes at Davos, and when Tucker Carlson flipped out on him and tried not to air it. Rutger, great to have you on. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, David.
So to begin with, A Hopeful History, Humankind. I'm interested in this because particularly right now, there are many people who maybe don't have the most optimistic perspective on humanity and on Homo sapiens. So what is your source of general optimism about humanity?
The book is really about a sort of silent revolution that has taken place in science within I'd say, the last 15 to 20 years. So what has happened is that scientists from very diverse disciplines, anthropologists, sociologists, psychologists, you name it, have moved from maybe a little bit cynical view of human nature to a much more positive, hopeful view of human nature. So in the book, I'm just sort of describing this whole process and trying to point this out, because what I discovered is that often these scientists don't even know it from each other, right? There was one psychologist who at one point during my research said to me, when I told her about, stuff that's happening in biology, and she said, "Oh my God, it's happening there as well." So I just wanted to let people know that this has been going on, and it may be a source for hope as well.
How do you make the case that human beings are sort of fundamentally good, to the extent that that's a kind of definable, actionable term?
Mm-hmm. Well, I wouldn't say that people are fundamentally good, right? We're clearly not angels.
Yes.
What I would say is that what you assume in other people is often what you get out of them, right? So if you assume that most people are selfish, and you'll start designing your institutions around that idea, your schools, your marketplaces, everything you do in your society, then that's what you get out of people, right? So what you assume is what you get. I think this is actually the defining idea of what we call neoliberalism, right? Which is basically people are selfish and deal with it and design everything around it. I think it has sort of produced the kind of people that the theory presupposed, and I think we can turn it around. And in the book, I try to give a lot of examples of, for example, schools or even organizations or even prisons that work with this sort of different kind of view of human nature, and then get some pretty interesting results as well.
Well, that's what's so interesting about it, which is, as you point out, if you take an economic perspective, if you believe people are fundamentally greedy, you then design an economic system around that, and it has major implications that are difficult to undo, even if people aren't fundamentally greedy.
Yeah.
If you look at evolutionary psychology, if you look at etc., every one of the systems we've designed is based around some of these core ideas. So the implications are actually not just theoretical and trivial.
No.
They're very real.
It's a quite revolutionary idea. So at first it may sound like, oh, this guy has written some nice happy clappy book about how human beings are friendly. No, actually the implications are really revolutionary, because, if we cannot trust each other, then we need them, right, to keep us in check. Then we need the CEOs and the managers and the bankers and the monarchs and the generals and you name it. Then we need those in power. Then we need hierarchy. If actually most people are pretty decent and can be trusted, then we can move to a radically different society, that is much more egalitarian, where people have the freedom to make their own choices. Suddenly all kinds of things become possible that initially were not possible at all.
At what sort of level of focus do you think is the right one to make these observations about humanity? And I'll give you an example of what I mean. You could take, for example, the Kitty Genovese story of 1964 and the bystander effect, and use that to extrapolate about human nature. Or you could say, hey, you know what? Over time, war has become less and less common. You're right. These are very different levels of focus, which may get you to different conclusions about human nature. Where do you think we should start evaluating what human nature is?
Well, I think you need to look at all these things. In the book, I start with a very old theory within Western culture, which is the idea of veneer theory, right? And the idea goes like this. Supposedly, civilization is only a thin veneer. And as soon as something happens, say a war or a natural disaster, or you shipwreck on an island, then supposedly people reveal their true selves. And, they show that they're really animals and they're selfish. If you look, for example, at the news coverage of natural disasters, it's pretty much always like this. It's always veneer theory. The news is full of stories about looting and violence and plunder, all kinds of horrible stories. But actually what sociologists have known, basically since the 1960s, is that what you get every single time after a natural disaster is an explosion of cooperation. People are really working together. A great example is what happened after Katrina in the US. Rebecca Solnit has written a fantastic book about this, A Paradise Built in Hell. But there are many other examples around the globe. So it's really the opposite of veneer theory. But still, this theory is so deeply entrenched in our culture, the idea that deep down we're all selfish. It goes back all the way to the ancient Greeks. You find it with the Christian church fathers, the idea that we're all born as sinners. Even the Enlightenment philosophers, David Hume, Adam Smith. I think you could argue that the US itself was sort of founded on the idea that people are selfish. If you read some of the texts of the founding fathers, John Adams, for example, he wrote an essay that said all men would be tyrants if they could. Or James Madison, who said, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. Let's be real. Let's assume that most people are selfish. So often when people say, oh, you got to be a realist, they say, well, don't be too idealistic, right? Otherwise, you're naive. And so I think that the larger project here is sort of to try and redefine what it means to be a realist. Is that actually the realistic scientific position these days is to sort of conclude that actually human beings have evolved to cooperate. And there's actually this process in our evolutionary history that biologists call survival of the friendliest, which is very much the opposite of what I had always thought.
What role in this analysis does the idea of a sort of multi-layer evolutionary selection have to play? The idea that an individual being greedy within a group that cooperates may be a more relevant way to look than simply humans are individually greedy or not greedy?
Well, there are certainly different theories right now within biology, right? Whether you should look at evolution on the individual level or on the group level. And there's a lot of scientific debate going on there. And to be honest, I don't really have a big preferred position here. I think sort of the more important takeaway of developments within biology of the past couple of years, say 15 to 20 years, is that actually biologists have discovered this process of what they call survival of the friendliest, right? So for thousands of years, it was actually the friendliest among us who had the most kids. Imagine Donald Trump in prehistory. It's an impossibility. He wouldn't have survived for long. People wouldn't have liked him, wouldn't want to cooperate with him, would have expelled him from the group and probably would have died alone, right? Or if he was really nasty, would have been executed by the group. So we know this from, studies from nomadic hunter-gatherer tribes around the globe, that being friendly, being humble was really a prerequisite if you wanted to survive. Now, it's only recently in this era that we call sort of the civilized era that everything has changed. And nowadays, there seems to be this process that we call survival of the shameless, right? Where so often, if you are shameless, that can actually be an advantage, which is, I think, highly unnatural for us as a species. Because, one of the most fascinating things that I discovered during my research is that human beings are actually the only species in the animal kingdom that blush, which is a fascinating fact, that we blush. And for thousands of years, it was an evolutionary advantage for us because it helped us to cooperate. And I think we need to go back to that vision of human nature.
So I want to ask about what your vision of human nature would imply maybe the economic system should be. But before we get to that, the veneer theory. Is it too early to see if or how that applies to the world reaction to coronavirus? Or do you have some sense of if and how that applies to how we're currently seeing the world react to that pandemic?
Well, obviously, at first, there were some stories, or quite a lot of stories in the press about people hoarding toilet paper and, even fighting over toilet paper. And again, it was very tempting to conclude that, oh, here we have a crisis. People are selfish once again. I think by now we can zoom out and say that actually the vast majority of most people has actually been pro-social in nature. Most people are actually helping each other. There's quite some evidence accumulating now from different countries is that, it mostly brings out the positive, the good in people. There's been so many initiatives from the bottom up, groups on WhatsApp and on Facebook and neighbors helping each other, et cetera, et cetera. And this is all not very surprising to sociologists because, as I said, they've known for a very long time that most people pull together during a time of crisis. It's not what the Hollywood movies have taught you. It's not like panic and everyone going nuts and crazy, blah, blah, blah. It's very much the opposite. One of the most striking eyewitness accounts that I discovered during my research was, for example, how some people behaved during 9/11, when there were going down the stairs of the Twin Towers as they were burning, and people were literally saying, "No, you go first. No, you go first. No, this is crazy," but it actually happened.
So you talked about how seeing human nature as fundamentally greedy implies or maybe justifies the neoliberal economic framework, which is very interesting. If someone were to accept your fundamental view of human nature, what is the economic system that would logically follow from that?
Well, you could do a lot of things. Actually, I started writing this book because I had first written a book about the idea of giving everyone a guaranteed basic income, right? So this was Utopia for Realists. And the book was full of studies and examples and experiments that showed that this could actually work. People in general have sort of two objections against the idea, and they say, well, it doesn't work because, people are lazy and they'll stop working. Or they'll say, you can't do it because people will waste the money. They'll just spend it on drugs or alcohol. These are like the two most common objections. And so I sort of tried to collect all this evidence and say, it actually does work. We have tried it, and the science says it works. So I went on a book tour in a couple of countries, and again and again and again, I found myself discussing human nature with people. Because so often people would say, yeah, okay, maybe this works on a local level. Maybe this works in this particular experiment here or there in Canada or in the US in the 70s, but that was a very different place, highly exceptional. In the end, you just got to look at human nature and be realistic. So I started to understand that for so many of the exciting ideas that I cared about, and not only basic income, but also, for example, different ways to do democracy, participatory democracy, they all presupposed a different view, a more hopeful view of human nature. And then I realized that actually I didn't have that view myself. I had studied history. I had, studied so many of these sort of cynical experiments from the 60s, the Stanford prison experiment, or the Milgram experiment that many people will know with the shock machine. So I started basically on a journey basically to see if I could actually realistically adopt a more hopeful view of human nature. And that resulted in this book.
And is there a specific, from the point of view of the vast majority of so-called Western democracies, is there low-hanging fruit or so-called specific policies that would be the ones that most obviously could be changed for the betterment of society on the basis of your newfound optimism?
Well, maybe it's interesting to zoom in on prisons, which is one of the most radical applications of this theory of human nature. If you go to Norway, you'll find prisons that are really, really weird and strange, where they really treat inmates as if they're actually people. So there are prisons like Bastøy or Halden, very close to Oslo, where you'll find, people who have been convicted of murders or rapes or pretty horrible things, but still get the freedom, to read books. There's a cinema. There's even a music studio. They have their own music label that is called Criminal Records. And you would even, some people would say, well, this is like some kind of holiday resort. But then you look at the science behind it, right? You look at the statistics, and in particular, you look at the recidivism rate. And you realize that actually Norway has the lowest recidivism rate in the world. So the chance that someone will commit another crime, after he or she gets out of prison, that's the recidivism rate, is nowhere as low as in Norway. So these prisons work, even though they don't really look like prisons. They're highly, highly effective. Then you look at prisons in the US, and you realize that actually these prisons have the highest recidivism rate in the world, right? If you treat people like crap, there will be crap. I can't make it easier than that. If you treat people like people, they will behave like people. This, in the case of prisons, it really goes against your intuition, right? You really sort of, the intuition says vengeance, people who've done these horrible things, you want vengeance, you want to lock them up, you want them to suffer. But if you realistically look at what works, then I think Norway really leads the way here.
Yeah, it's also counterintuitive. One might imagine you want prison to be really bad so people are more incentivized to avoid going back, and it just does not seem to actually function in that way. Obviously.
And the other problem is that prisons can become sort of universities for crime. So this is really the case in the US. People come in maybe for small minor offenses, drug offenses or something like that, and then they become hardened criminals in the prison system, right? For the book, I looked at the history of the system in the US, and it's really astonishing to find out that actually in the early 70s, the US experimented with Norway-style prisons, and it worked really well. It's just that after that, history took a different direction. Same is true for basic income, by the way. The US almost implemented a guaranteed basic income under Nixon. There's no country that came as close to implementing a basic income as the US. But that didn't happen in the end.
No, it didn't.
Because of a lot of bizarre coincidences.
Yeah, even, between World War I and II, there was a moment where the direction for healthcare in the United States was going towards universal healthcare, but it was deemed to be too much like what was happening in Germany at the time. And for political reasons, it was not pursued, as we, of course, now know. We've been speaking with Rutger Bregman, historian, author of Humankind, A Hopeful History, and, of course, author of the best-selling Utopia for Realists. I so appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thank you.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So let's talk about voting by mail. Very important issue in general, very important issue, acutely so right now because of the coronavirus pandemic. I have for you today Exhibit A about why Donald Trump is scared to death and completely opposed to the November presidential election being done as a vote by mail election. And the reason is very simple. Vote by mail means more people vote. More people voting is not good for Donald Trump, and it is generally not good for the Republican Party. The example comes from Kansas. Kansas Democrats decided to do this year's primary or caucus as vote by mail. This is the Democratic selection. In 2016, Kansas voted in person, and about 39,000 people voted, 39,000. In 2020, because of the pandemic, it's vote by mail. And they have already had 138,000 people vote. And this is considering that the outcome is a foregone conclusion. Joe Biden is the only candidate left. Everybody else has dropped out. Bernie's gone. And still, with vote by mail this year, we have a turnout in Kansas that is 3.5 times that of 2016. There's almost nothing to vote for, in a sense. And turnout is orders of magnitude greater than what it was in 2016. So we know that vote by mail in November of 2020 would be a turnout boosting mechanism. We know that even pandemic aside, just in a normal election, letting everybody vote by mail would likely increase turnout. And that's not good for Republicans, and that's not good for Trump. Why do you think they've spent 20 years trying to reduce the number of people that are voting? Now, there are some other factors here, which could account for this huge rise in the number of people voting in the Democratic caucus in Kansas. One is, maybe there's a motivation to vote against Donald Trump in November for Democrats. And it's motivating some of them early, particularly because of the incompetent response to coronavirus. So you've got a lot of fired up Kansas Democrats whose enthusiasm for voting in November is being reflected in that they are also participating in the Democratic primary. That's possible. That's possible. But these are massive numbers. Again, 3.5 times already the total turnout from 2016. And Trump recently saying on multiple occasions he doesn't want vote by mail. Remember this?
Yeah, I wanted to get back to something you were saying yesterday about people going to Wisconsin and voting in the middle of this pandemic, really putting their lives on the line. And you said, well, if they do that, vote by mail, perhaps we'll have voter fraud in this country. I just wanted to ask you, voters in 5 states, Utah, Colorado, Hawaii, Washington, and Oregon, all vote by mail. Can you or the White House staff or your campaign provide any evidence to back up your claim that mail-in voting is rife with fraud, like the example you gave of people working in rooms filling out false ballots? Sure. You've been talking about voter fraud since the beginning of this administration.
Very fair.
And where's the evidence of it?
I think there's a lot of evidence, but we'll provide you with some, okay? And there's evidence that's being compiled just like it's being compiled in the state of California, where they settled with Judicial Watch saying that 1 million people should not have been voting. And you saw that? Did you, wait, excuse me. Well, I'm just telling you. I'm telling you, in California, in the great state of California, they settled, and we could have gone a lot further.
So Trump with no real answers there, because the reality is vote by mail is not going to dramatically increase fraud. And then previously, here's Donald Trump admitting that some of these ideas that Democrats have, like vote by mail, these would mean Republicans don't win, which may be true in the sense that the more of the will of the people that's represented at the ballot box, the less likely maybe it is that a con man like Donald Trump would be able to get into the Oval Office. Take a look. Here's Trump admitting it.
Just the common facts. I mean, they have a majority in the House, and therefore you need their vote, and they want to get certain things. I will tell you this. If you look at before and after, the things they had in there were crazy. They had things, levels of voting that if you ever agreed to it, you'd never have a Republican elected in this country again.
Levels of voting, which if you had, would mean a Republican never gets elected again. This is what is being talked about. And we are seeing it in Kansas. And Republicans know. I mean, listen, to their credit, Republicans aren't wrong. They know that if it's easier to vote, it's not good for them. They know that if there is less friction, if there are fewer obstacles, if the barriers to entry to voting are lower, it's not good for them because the will of the people will be more accurately represented by a larger share of the population of the United States. We are seeing an example of it here. All the policy that Republicans are pushing when it comes to how elections are done is about suppressing the vote. Imagine the damage that vote by mail would do to Republican efforts to suppress voting, not because of fraud, not because of dead people voting, not because of any of that stuff, simply because a larger share of the population is casting a ballot. So when you look back at the last 15 years, 20 years, I mean, you know, redistricting, gerrymandering has been going on for a while. But when you look at voter ID, efforts to reduce early voting, efforts to reduce the number of polling places, efforts to purge voter rolls, voter intimidation at polling places, constantly fear-mongering about almost mathematically non-existent double voting, in-person voter fraud, all of that stuff, plus the gerrymandering. We now understand why, and it's very, very clear. All of a sudden, vote by mail would be devastating to Republicans and potentially to Donald Trump. And so that's why they're going to do everything they can to stop it. Now, let's talk about strategy a little bit. This matters more in swing states. And what I mean by that is, whatever happens between now and November, California is not going to vote for Donald Trump. They're going to vote for Joe Biden, whether it's vote by mail, whether it's voting in person. Turnout may be depressed if it's voting in person and the virus is raging. Okay, California is not going to be a difference maker. We have an electoral college system. If Massachusetts votes by mail or not, Trump's not going to win here in Massachusetts. The important states are the ones that are always important in the system that we have. We're talking about Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Florida, the places that could turn the election from Trump to Biden or vice versa. That's where we need to be working extra hard to get vote by mail. Who is it going to be up to? Well, it's ultimately going to be up to each individual state. It's going to be up to the governor. It's going to be up to the state legislatures in those states. This is why, once again, local elections matter. When you look at many of the progressive successes of the 20th century, what made sure that those reforms stuck was having a Supreme Court that would uphold them. That's called doing the groundwork. And much the same way, what could be the factor, I mean, I don't believe it's hyperbolic to say that the November of 2020 election could hinge on, is there a Republican or Democratic governor? Is there a Republican or Democratic state legislature? If it ultimately hinges on, do they get to vote by mail or not? Those are decisions that we can go back to when the state legislatures were elected, to when the gubernatorial elections happened. This is why every election matters and has to be taken seriously. Republicans are scared. The numbers in Kansas tell us exactly why they should be scared. Donald Trump's former White House communications director, Anthony Scaramucci, has again admitted something which I've been covering for years at this point, which is that Donald Trump has difficulty reading. He really doesn't read, and he struggles to read. Anthony Scaramucci has been doing interviews recently. He's been more honest than maybe we are used to hearing from people who worked for Trump or who work for Trump. And he's admitted to a number of things, including that Donald Trump can't read very well. Check out this clip from an interview with Anand Giridharadas, who's been a previous guest on the David Pakman Show as well.
I'm not a diagnostician, but my guess is that he probably had an undiagnosed learning disability as a kid. Maybe it's a form of dyslexia or something like that. And so his reading comprehension levels are not where his IQ possibly is. Okay. Now he's in decline right now, but you'd have to stipulate that he's a reasonably smart guy. I mean, he built a business, he built a, television show. He made a name for himself. And in 17 short months, he went from being a reality television star to the presidency of the United States. So we have to stipulate that there's intelligence in there, but it's what kind of intelligence?
So Scaramucci is obviously not saying it in as definitive or aggressive terms as we have suggested before, but Scaramucci also knows that Trump struggles to read, and he makes it clear there. This is not making fun of people. This is not making fun of learning disabilities. This is simply pointing out, don't we need a president who can read well and regularly reads? We suspect Trump hasn't read a book in his adult life. There's no evidence that Trump has read a book in his adult life. He's never mentioned reading anything other than his own book, Art of the Deal, which he didn't write. Tony Schwartz wrote it. And the Bible, which, if you believe Trump reads the Bible, okay, I may have a bridge to sell you. But remember that I've been covering this for years, and there's interest in it and a lot of agreement. Back in February of 2017, we did a story called Trump Fails Basic Literacy Test. It got nearly 3.4 million views on YouTube, another 7 million on Facebook. This was subsequently picked up around the world, including in France and other countries, and it explains a lot. Now, not being able to read well doesn't mean Trump's a bad person. Not being able to read well doesn't mean Trump is wrong on policy. He is usually wrong on policy, but for other reasons. But it explains a lot, to quote Donald Trump, including things like this from earlier this week.
Dickinson, Hologic, and Cephahide.
This reading deficit has been widely corroborated. Saturday Night Live's Pete Davidson said when Trump was hosting SNL, Trump couldn't seem to read the scripts. I've played this clip for you before.
What happened with the Trumpster?
Okay, so he's like, he doesn't really know how to read.
For real.
Yeah, and he loves to improv.
Yeah.
So during the table read, he before we were gonna read before he had to read each line, and he's the host, so he's at everything.
Yeah.
He would go, I'm not gonna say this. I think I'm gonna say it the way I want to say it. Is that okay? Is that okay, Lauren? Is that everything? And everybody's like, what? And then this is my favorite part is there was a sketch that we wrote where he's at Disneyland with his daughter, and the line is, all right, let's get out of here. Turkey legs? Let's go get turkey legs? And he doesn't know how to read. So he went, all right, let's get out of here, turkey legs. He called his daughter turkey legs.
Maybe that was his improv.
Oh, no, it wasn't. And then he looked up, he doesn't get it. He thinks if everybody's laughing with him, but we're all laughing at him.
So that's not new. We've covered that previously. Noel Casler worked with Trump on The Apprentice and says Trump couldn't read, although with Noel Casler, it seemed maybe it was more about Trump's inability to sit still rather than simply not being able to read. Noel Casler, we've heard about the possible uppers stuff with The Apprentice. So the point is, we know from sources inside the White House, Trump's presidential daily briefings have been reduced from what's normally many pages of text to just a couple of pages, to just 1 page, to just 1 page that is half charts and graphs. And even that Trump is accepting with low frequency. So this is not good. And the reason it's not good is because it's tough to be informed if you're not reading a lot as president. That's how Barack Obama was informed. That's how George W. Bush read a lot. He read political material. He also just read books. We know that doesn't mean Bush is a great guy. Doesn't mean he was a great president. But he was reading at least. He came to many wrong decisions, but he was reading. Bill Clinton spent a ton of time reading intelligence, reporting, books, etc. Trump simply doesn't do it. And all politics aside, That's a fundamental liability when you're president of the United States. It's sad more than anything, but it has a real effect on Trump's ability to be a leader, and it's not a good effect. I'll tell you that right now. We have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Yesterday we talked about when it comes to people who hear Trump talk about injecting bleach and they go and they ingest bleach. Should we care about that? Is it a Darwinian thinning of the herd? Should we not care about the plight of the conned? Here's a voicemail about exactly that issue.
Hey, David, Jeff in Oregon. Hey, I heard you suggesting that we should absolve Trump's followers. But my take is there is no con man without suckers. There is no cult leader without cult followers. Certainly, Republican politicians who know better should be held criminally culpable, but his followers need to be deprogrammed and must look in the mirror and think of what they've caused.
Listen, I am not trying to absolve people who go and inject bleach of any responsibility, but the caller says they need to be deprogrammed. Well, that means that they've been programmed to begin with, and they didn't program themselves. So I think that there's plenty of blame to go around. We have an education system that is failing people. We have a political system that is failing people. We have an economic system that is failing people. I'm not looking to absolve anybody of the actions that they choose to take and of personal responsibility. But I do stop short of saying, hey, let's absolve the con men of any responsibility and simply criticize those who have been conned. That doesn't seem right to me either. We've got a terrific bonus show for you today. Don't miss it. Become a member or patron today to get instant access. I'll talk to you then or otherwise tomorrow.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.